Good morning, everybody. That was my first gift to you. Would someone turn off the light so I can? Yeah, yeah.
But then the video won't.
Oh, then the video won't work?
But it's okay.
It's okay. She says, yeah.
Thanks.
So I've known Genevieve a long time. I live in Austin, Texas, and I met her about 15 years ago when I moved to Texas, but I'd heard about her before that from my mother, who said that there's this amazing woman that she was working for in Austin who was using her fortune for social change in the world. And when I moved to Austin, I had the pleasure of meeting Jen, so we go back a long way. And I was actually going to give this presentation about my own mother this morning, who's also a native Texan, but then I realized that would be hogging the show, and why just talk about one Texas woman when I can talk about several. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to start by talking about Clara Driscoll. Now, Clara was one of these women who was rather fortunate in that she was born to a family her father was a banker and an oil man. And as a banker, when people would repay the loans, he would say, you can either repay me in money or land. And he would always take the land. Well, this was a good deal because not very long after that, oil and natural gas were discovered on all these acres of land. So Clara was born and actually into a fortune. It was like being born having won the lottery. And she grew up, she had a wonderful education. She got to go to Europe to study. And she then came back to San Antonio, and she was staying at a hotel there, and there was a woman, Adina de Zavala, who was a daughter of the Republic of Texas. You get that distinction if one of your ancestors fought in one of the early wars of Texas. And so Adina heard that there was a mission that was going to be bought and torn down by a hotel company. So Adina ran to this hotel because she'd heard that there were some philanthropists there, and she was going to talk to them about buying the land. Well, to her dismay, the philanthropists had left the day before, and so she burst into tears, and the bellman said, well, what's the matter? And she said, well, I need to meet these philanthropists. He said, no problem. There's this 23-year-old woman, Clara Driscoll. So Adina went up and knocked on Clara's door and told her the story, and Clara pulled out her checkbook and wrote out a check to save the Alamo. So she actually bought it for about $5,000 down payment, and she ended up over the course of several years paying $65,000 for it. Her father made sure she always had money in her checking account, and she is actually known now as the savior of the Alamo. And these are some of the checks that she wrote, the actual checks that she wrote to save it. The state of Texas ended up reimbursing her for that money, and the senator who introduced the bill later became her husband. He was then appointed ambassador to, I think it was Bolivia or Chile, but he was an alcoholic, so she soon divorced him and changed her name back to Mrs. Clara Driscoll. She lived in Austin, and also had part of the time in Austin, part of the time in Corpus Christi. In Corpus Christi, she became the president of the bank. She was one of the first women bankers in Texas. And she also became the National Democratic Committee chairwoman. So she was very active in politics. And it was said of her that she could drink, smoke, cuss, and outspend all the other politicians. One of the things that she was active in is something called the Texas Federation of Women's Clubs. Now, the Texas Federation of Women's Clubs, like in most states in the United States, was responsible for building the hospitals, the schools, the libraries all over Texas. And the women decided that they wanted a state headquarters, so they built one in Austin. You see it here, this beautiful building. The only problem is that they didn't have the money to pay for it when it came due. So they approached Clara Driscoll, and she started a fundraising campaign and actually just said, oh, forget about it, and wrote out the check herself for $92,000 in the early 1930s. And the best part about that check is that she made it payable to yourselves. So whoever, I'm thinking, too bad it didn't show up in our mailbox, right? Whoever got it would have been able to cash it, but that was just the kind of person she was. One of the other things that she did, and I'll just talk a little bit about some of her legacies as you see in her gifts that she gave, she built this wonderful Italian villa, which she called Laguna Gloria, and it's on the banks of the Colorado River. It's built on the place where Stephen F. Austin, who originally got the original land grant for Austin, chose as his homestead property because he picked it because it was the most beautiful piece of property in Austin. He never did end up settling there, but she bought the property from him. And then she decided that she wanted to go back to Corpus Christi, and so she donated this piece of property to the Austin Museum of Art. So now it's a wonderful place that we can have artwork, and then it's rented out for weddings and that kind of thing. But it's right on the base of the Colorado River. It's just a beautiful facility. And Jen recently told me a story that I have to now go back to Corpus and research, because what happened with Clara's fortune after she died, she had no children, so she left her fortune to she opened a foundation, and the purpose of the foundation was to build a children's hospital in Corpus Christi to give free medical care to the children of South Texas. And here's a picture of that hospital now. Although Jen told me that actually she left her fortune to the children of Chile, and there was a big lawsuit, and apparently the hospital people won. So now I have to go back and find out what the real story is, because Jen's from Corpus, so she knows. That's right. So now I'm going to talk about another woman, Ovida Kolpabi. How many of y'all are familiar with her, have heard her name? Some of you? Okay. So Ovida, isn't this a great hat that she's wearing, by the way? You just have to love these hats. I think we should actually start bringing these hats back. Ovida was born in a small town in Texas, in Killeen, Texas, the same place that Liz Carpenter, if you know of her, was also born. They were actually born in the same year. And her father was an attorney and also a member of the Texas State Legislature. And she was really smart, so after school she would go to her father's law office and read the congressional record. That's all the law books. So by the time she was 16, she had read the entire congressional record. So, because she was bored, she was bored with school, she actually tried to drop out. She became the youngest parliamentarian in Texas and the first woman. So at age 20, before she could even vote, she was telling the men how to run the legislature. She actually even later, while she was pregnant with her second child, wrote a textbook called Mr. Chairman, which was the rules of order used as a textbook. She married Governor Hobby, who was actually the 20 years her senior, and he was the man who actually signed the legislation for women to get the right to vote in Texas. And she and him owned the Houston Post together. So she was in Washington, D.C. when the draft was instated at an FCC conference, and one of the generals there said, we're getting 10,000 letters a day from women all over the U.S. wanting to know what are we doing with their sons that are being drafted. So would you just write a letter that we can send to these women to let them know? So she said, no problem. She writes the letter. Then the general comes back to her and said, we've got a lot of women who said, hey, we want to do something also for the war effort. This was World War II. So could you just draw up a plan for a women's army? So she said, okay, so she did. So then the general calls her back and he says, well, your plan's great. Would you mind coming to Washington, D.C. to head up the Women's Auxiliary Army Corps? And at that point she said, look, I'm running a major newspaper. I have 2 small children. I have a husband. No, I'm not going to do it. Hangs up the phone. A couple weeks later, it's Sunday night, the phone rings again. She answers it. It's the general saying, would you please? She's like, no. Hangs up. She comes back to the dining room table. Her husband said, well, who was that? And she said, well, it's General Cyril. She's like, well, why is he calling you? And she said, well, it's the second time he wants me to come to Washington and run this women's army. And he said, and so the story goes, her husband said, you should not have made him ask you twice. It is your duty and you will do it. And she did. So she commuted between Houston and Washington, D.C. I know, and she said it took her 3 days each way. So she had an apartment in D.C. and then also her home in Houston. Now the family had money, so they had a nanny that, you know, took care of her kids and a whole housing staff. But she became the director of the Women's Army Corps, and I argue that she was actually one of the unsung heroes of the feminist movement, because when she took over the director of the Women's Army Corps, there were about 57 jobs that the Army said women were qualified for. 2 years later, by the time she retired, she had identified 256 different jobs that women could do. And so I think that she was really one of, you know, an unsung early feminist hero. So here she is being sworn in. There were no uniforms. She, in fact, had the only uniform for the Women's Army Corps. And when she went on her recruiting efforts, she would just wash her uniform every night and blow dry it with a hairdryer in her hotel room. Here she is being sworn in. Notice the hat. And here she is. Now, she said she never did learn how to salute properly. She was the first woman to become a colonel in the United States Army. And this hat that she's wearing was actually named after her. It was called the hobby hat. And they said they called it that because she was really the only one who looked good wearing it. Well, one of the people that she met during her tenure as the director of the Women's Army Corps was General Eisenhower, and he kept sending her letters saying, would you please send me more of those women, because they can do 4 times as much as women can do in half the time. He was so impressed with her that when he became President of the United States, he appointed her as the first Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare. And here she is being sworn in. Notice again the hat. She was actually the person who was the Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare during the polio epidemic. And she resigned shortly after the vaccine came out, and there was some, in the press they really said that, you know, part of the reason that people died because of the vaccine was that she pushed it through too quickly, and there was this whole scandal about it. So some people say that maybe she resigned as a result of that. Her granddaughter said that she thought that actually that whole thing was the one thing that she regretted in her whole life, if she could have gone back and done it all over again. But at the end of her tenure of the Women's Army Corps, she began collecting art. And she became a wonderful philanthropist and has donated tons of paintings to the Houston Museum of Art, was instrumental in getting the Houston Symphony going. And she is quoted as saying, you know, I think I will like Houston if they ever finish it. And here she is. A very graceful woman. She's about 5'6", and she was always mad because when she was in the Women's Army Corps, you know, the reporters were always asking her about what she was wearing, and you know, because as a woman, you didn't take her as seriously, you know, asking her questions. Well, you know, how are you taking care of your kids? Things that you would understand that people would want to know, but she was always of the opinion that it didn't matter if a person was a man or a woman, but could they do the job? So the next person I want to tell you about is my mom. Here she is, a picture on her porch swing. And my mother's distinction is she's one of the mothers of women in Texas history, of the writing of women in Texas history. And her first book was called I Am Annie Mae. And it's a story of an African-American woman in Dallas. It became a musical and toured all over the United States. She was a member of something called the Foundation for Women's Resources, which actually I think Frida Worden up here was also part of.
Yeah, Ruth got me in that one.
Yeah, my mom was a big instigator. If she saw someone that was competent and qualified, she would garner them and make them do her project. I mean, invite them to do her projects for her. So one day, Ann Richards, before she was governor, went to San Antonio. There's something there called the Texas Institute for Heroes. And she was walking down this Texas Institute where there's these huge statues of Texas heroes. And her little 9-year-old daughter turned to her and said, "Mom, where are all the women?" And Ann Richards looked and said, "Oh yeah, she's right. There were no women there. There were Sam Houston and Stephen F. Austin, all the great men, but no women." So Ann Richards came back and decided that she would start a foundation for women's resources to really bring forth the history of Texas women. And my mother was the research historian for that project. And I didn't put Ann Richards in this presentation, but I could have. As you see, she is, according to Texas Monthly, one hot mama. Mom wrote 20 books on women in Texas history by the time she passed away. She wrote 3 on Black Texas women alone. The one on the left, Black Texas Women, has people like Barbara Jordan in it. You can kind of see on the upper right hand. And that book was so thick that it was actually turned into 2 books. The first book was the stories, and the second book was the source documents. Now, as academics, how many of y'all in here are academics? So you probably know that there's always this conversation about, you know, if you're a white woman, can you write about black people and blah, blah, blah. And Mom really didn't want to write this book. She wanted it written, but she couldn't find an African-American woman available. The ones who were qualified were all busy trying to get their own careers going, doing the tenure track thing. So Mom was like, okay, fine, I'll just do it myself. She wrote a book on women in the Texas legislature called Capital Women. And I once asked her, you know, why didn't you run for politics yourself? Because she was just brilliant at it, and she loved